My name is Emma Whitaker, and on my 28th birthday, security escorted me out of the company my grandfather built. Not because I stole anything, not because I failed, not because I broke any rules. I was fired because the people running the company finally believed there was nobody left to protect me, and for about 3 hours, they were right. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had spent 5 years preparing for that exact morning. Before I tell you how my stepmother lost everything she thought she owned. Before I tell you how my stepbrothers' celebration lasted less than 1 business day. And before I tell you why an attorney was already waiting for me before I even knew I needed one. Let me take you back. Because stories like this never start with a firing. They start years earlier. Usually with a family deciding who matters and who doesn't. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My father, Thomas Whitaker, worked for Whitaker Industrial Supply. The company had been started by my grandfather, Walter Whitaker, in 1978. At first, it was a tiny warehouse, 1 forklift, 3 employees, 1 delivery truck. 40 years later, it supplied manufacturing parts across 3 states and employed over 200 people. My grandfather built every inch of it, and everybody knew it. What fewer people knew was that he was also the kindest man I'd ever met. My mother died when I was 9. Cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. I remember details I wish I didn't. Hospital smells. Doctors avoiding eye contact. The way my father's shoulders looked smaller afterward. For a while it was just us. Dad and me. Then Denise arrived, and everything changed. Denise was charming, at least at first, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, baked cookies for neighbors, and could make strangers feel like old friends in under 5 minutes. My father fell in love fast. A year later they got married, and Denise brought her son, Kyle. He was 10, I was 11. At first I thought I was getting a brother. Instead, I got competition. Not because Kyle disliked me. Actually, Kyle barely thought about me at all. The problem was Denise. Because from the moment she entered our lives, she started dividing the world into 2 categories, people who belonged to her and everybody else. Guess which category I ended up in? The changes happened slowly. Slow enough that nobody could point to a specific moment. Kyle got new clothes, I got hand-me-downs. Kyle got a gaming console, I got told money was tight. Kyle got praise for average grades, I got asked why mine weren't higher. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just 1,000 tiny cuts, one after another, over years. And if you've ever lived through that kind of family dynamic, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's never one big thing. It's death by paper cuts. The first person who noticed wasn't my father. It was my grandfather, Walter. I was 12 when he caught me crying behind the warehouse. Not dramatic crying, quiet crying, the kind where you wipe your face before anyone sees. He sat beside me on the loading dock, didn't ask questions, didn't force a conversation, just waited. Finally he said, "Bad day?" I nodded. "Want to talk about it?" I shrugged. He nodded back. Then we sat in silence. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Before he said something I never forgot. He said, "People tell you who they are every day, Emma. Most folks just don't listen." I didn't understand what he meant back then. Not fully. Years later, I would. Grandpa Walter started bringing me to work during summers. Most kids would have hated it. Warehouse floors, inventory counts, forklift inspections, shipping logs. Nothing glamorous. But I loved it, because Grandpa treated me differently than everyone else. He didn't see me as a kid. He saw me as someone worth teaching. When I was 13, he taught me inventory systems. At 14, he taught me purchasing. At 15, he showed me profit margins. At 16, he explained how payroll worked. Most teenagers spent summers at pools. I spent mine learning how a business stayed alive. And honestly, I preferred it. Kyle wasn't interested, not even a little. He liked the title of being Walter Whitaker's grandson, but not the work. He'd show up at company events, take photos, wear expensive clothes, talk about how one day he'd run the business, then disappear before lunch. Meanwhile, I was unloading trucks, checking shipments, learning operations. Grandpa noticed, and so did everyone else, especially the employees. One afternoon when I was 17, we were closing the warehouse. Just me and Grandpa. The sun was setting through the loading doors. Everything was orange. Dust floating in the light. He handed me a clipboard, then asked, "Do you know why most family businesses fail?" I shook my head. He smiled. "Because somebody mistakes ownership for contribution." I remember laughing. "I don't get it." He pointed toward the executive offices, then toward the warehouse. "The people who think they own everything usually build nothing." Then he pointed at the warehouse crew. "The people who build everything usually think they own nothing." He looked directly at me. The trick is knowing the difference. At the time, it felt like another one of Grandpa's lessons. Years later, I'd realize it was a warning. When I graduated high school, I received a partial scholarship to Ohio State. I wanted to study business management. Kyle barely graduated. His grades were awful. But somehow Denise convinced my father that Kyle needed support. So Dad paid for Kyle's college. Fully tuition, housing, not food, everything. Meanwhile, I worked nights. Took loans and balanced classes with warehouse shifts. Did it hurt? Yeah. Of course it did. But I stopped expecting fairness a long time ago. Expectations are where disappointment lives, and I was tired of being disappointed. Then things got worse. My father died unexpectedly during my junior year. Heart attack. No warning. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. I was 21. Kyle was 20, and suddenly Denise had control of everything my father left behind. The house, savings, investments. All of it. She promised we'd remain one family, that nothing would change. 3 months later, she removed me from the family health insurance plan, said it was too expensive. Kyle stayed on. Of course. I remember sitting in my apartment after that conversation, looking at my bank account, trying to figure out how I'd pay for insurance, and wondering why I still felt surprised. Grandpa called that evening. I hadn't told him what happened. Somehow he already knew. He invited me to dinner. His house, just the two of us. When I arrived, he had steaks on the grill. My favorite. We ate mostly in silence. Then he said, "You're carrying too much." I laughed. "Story of my life." He shook his head. "No." Then he pointed at me. "You keep carrying things that belong to other people." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He took a sip of iced tea. "It means you've spent years earning love that should have been free." That hit harder than I wanted to admit. Because deep down, I knew he was right. After graduation, I joined Whitaker Industrial Supply full-time. Entry-level operations, exactly where Grandpa insisted I start. I could have entered management. Everyone knew that. But Walter wouldn't allow it. He said, "If you're ever going to lead workers, you better understand their jobs first." So I learned. Every single department, shipping, receiving, purchasing, inventory, scheduling, quality control. I became the person people called when problems appeared, and eventually those problems started leading me straight to Denise, and Kyle, and Uncle Richard. Richard was Grandpa's younger brother, 70 years old, lazy his entire life. He somehow held a consulting position despite never consulting on anything useful. Most days he sat in meetings, complained, collected checks, and talked about loyalty. Usually from people who'd never earned it. Grandpa tolerated him, barely. The older I got, the more I noticed strange things. Expense reports, missing inventory, questionable purchases, company money funding, personal vacations, luxury dinners, vehicle upgrades, Kyle charging electronics to corporate accounts, Richard approving contracts for friends. Nothing massive, but enough. Enough to make me uncomfortable. Whenever I mentioned it, Denise brushed it aside. Family takes care of family. That became her favorite phrase. Funny how people only say that when they're spending someone else's money. One rainy evening, 2 years before Grandpa died, he asked me to stay late. The warehouse had emptied, everyone gone. Just us. He was standing in his office looking out the window. Quiet, thinking. Finally he spoke. "Emma." I looked up. "Yeah?" He turned around, and for the first time in my life, he looked old, not weak, just tired, like a man carrying something heavy. He studied me for a long moment, then asked a question. One simple question, the question that changed everything. "Do you trust your family?" The room went completely silent. I remember hearing rain hitting the windows, the hum of fluorescent lights. My own breathing. Because somehow, I knew this wasn't casual conversation. This mattered, a lot, and after a very long pause, I answered honestly. "No." Grandpa nodded slowly, as if I'd just confirmed something he already knew. Then he looked away, toward the rain, toward the warehouse floor, toward the company he'd spent 40 years building. And he said quietly, "Good." I stared at him, confused. What? He looked back at me, his expression impossible to read. Then he smiled, a small smile, the kind that appears when someone finally reaches a decision. And that's when he said the words that would make sense years later. The words that started everything, he said, "Then we're running out of time." For weeks after that conversation, Grandpa acted completely normal, at least on the surface. He still arrived before sunrise, still walked the warehouse floor, still drank terrible coffee from the same stained mug he'd been using since the 1990s. But something had changed. I could feel it, the way you can feel a storm before the clouds arrive. He was planning something. I just didn't know what. 3 months later, he called me into his office. The office wasn't fancy. Walter Whitaker could have afforded marble floors and mahogany walls. Instead, he worked from a room that looked almost exactly the same as it had 30 years earlier. Metal desk, old filing cabinets, family photographs, a bookshelf filled with manuals nobody else ever touched. When I walked in, he handed me an envelope. Plain white. No markings, no explanation, just my name written on the front. Emma. That's it. I looked at him. "What's this?" He leaned back in his chair. "Something important." I laughed. "That narrows it down." He smiled. Then his face became serious, very serious. The kind of serious that immediately makes you pay attention. "Put it somewhere safe." I turned the envelope over. "What's inside?" "You'll know when it's time." I frowned. "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." For a moment I considered opening it right there. Grandpa must have seen the thought on my face, because he pointed a finger at me. "Don't." I stopped. He continued, "If life goes the way I hope it does, you'll never need it." Then he paused. "But if one particular thing happens," his expression darkened, "you'll be glad you listened." I wanted more information. I wanted details. But Walter Whitaker was impossible once he'd made up his mind. So I took the envelope, went home, and locked it inside a fireproof box. Then forgot about it, at least for a while. The following year was difficult. Grandpa's health started slipping. At first he blamed age, then stress, then work. But everyone could tell something was wrong. He lost weight, moved slower, coughed more, skipped lunches. The man who once worked 12-hour days suddenly looked exhausted after 4. Finally, doctors found the problem. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. I still remember hearing the diagnosis, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Nobody cried, nobody screamed, nobody panicked. The room just became quiet, like the entire world stopped breathing. Grandpa handled the news better than anyone. Maybe because he'd spent his entire life solving problems, even impossible ones. The day after his diagnosis, he came to work. The day after that, too. And the day after that. When I asked why, he shrugged. What am I supposed to do? Golf? That was Walter, practical to the very end. Meanwhile, Denise transformed overnight. Suddenly, she became the perfect daughter-in-law, attentive, helpful, concerned, always around, always offering assistance, always asking questions about company matters. Questions she had never cared about before. Questions about ownership, voting shares, assets, board structure, trusts, inheritance. Funny how illness makes some people reveal themselves. One afternoon, I walked into the conference room unexpectedly. Denise and Richard were inside, talking. They didn't notice me at first. Richard was saying, "If we're smart, everything transitions smoothly." Denise nodded. "Exactly." Then Richard added, "Once Walter's gone, there won't be anyone standing in our way." The room went silent. Because that's when they noticed me standing in the doorway. Neither looked embarrassed. Neither looked guilty. Denise simply smiled. That fake smile she always used. The one that never reached her eyes. Emma. I stared at both of them. Then turned around and left, without saying a word. That evening, I told Grandpa what I'd heard. Every word. Exactly as it happened. He listened quietly, never interrupting, never reacting. When I finished, he nodded, then asked a question. "Did that surprise you?" I thought about it. Honestly, no. Not really. Maybe it should have. But it didn't. Because deep down, I'd known for years exactly who those people were. I was just finally hearing them say it out loud. Grandpa sighed, then looked out the window. Good. There was that word again. Good. Not anger, not frustration, not disappointment. Good. Like he was confirming information, not receiving it. Over the next 6 months, Grandpa spent more time away from the office, doctors, hospitals, appointments, treatments. But every time he returned, he pulled me aside and taught me something. One week it was vendor negotiations. Another week it was commercial real estate. Then corporate governance. Then shareholder voting. Then acquisition strategy. It felt almost like he was trying to fit 10 years of lessons into 6 months, because maybe he was. One Friday afternoon, we sat together in the warehouse cafeteria. The lunch crowd had already left. It was just us. Grandpa pushed a folder across the table. Inside were employee records, names, dates, performance reviews. I looked confused. "What is this?" he smiled. "The company." I flipped through the pages. "These are employees." "Exactly." Then he leaned forward and said something I'll never forget. "A business isn't buildings." He tapped the folder. "It isn't trucks." Tap. "It isn't equipment." Tap. "It's people." Then he looked me directly in the eyes. "If you ever forget that, you'll become exactly like them." I knew who he meant. Denise. Richard. Kyle. The people already measuring the company in dollars, while Walter still measured it in lives. 3 months later, he retired officially, at least on paper. Nobody believed it, especially not him. But the board insisted. The doctors insisted. Eventually, even I insisted. So he stepped down. The retirement party filled the warehouse. 200 employees. Former workers, clients, friends. People he'd helped over 40 years. One after another, they told stories. Stories I had never heard. How Walter paid medical bills for employees, covered college tuition, saved jobs during recessions, gave second chances. Third chances, sometimes fourth chances. The room was packed, and for the first time I realized something. My grandfather wasn't respected because he was wealthy. He was respected because he was decent. And those are not the same thing. 6 weeks later, he died. Peacefully, at home. Early in the morning, with family nearby. I won't pretend it wasn't devastating, because it was. Losing Walter felt like losing gravity, like losing the thing that kept everything stable. The funeral was enormous. Hundreds of people attended. Employees filled entire rows. Former workers drove from other states. Vendors sent flowers. Customers sent letters. Everyone wanted to say goodbye. Everyone except Kyle, who spent most of the reception talking about future leadership opportunities. 3 days after the funeral, Denise called a meeting, executive staff only. I wasn't invited, which was strange, because I was director of operations, and should have been there. When I asked why, Denise smiled. That same fake smile. Then said, "We're restructuring." The next week, my office moved. The week after that, my responsibilities changed. The week after that, my budget disappeared. Little by little. Piece by piece. Exactly the way she'd treated me growing up. Not one big attack, 1,000 small cuts. By month 3, Kyle had a vice president title, despite knowing almost nothing about operations. Richard gained additional authority, despite contributing almost nothing, and I found myself reporting to people I'd trained. It would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. One evening, an employee named Carlos stopped me in the warehouse. Carlos had worked for Whitaker nearly 20 years. Good man, hard worker, the type every company depends on. He looked nervous. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He lowered his voice. "Are you leaving?" I blinked. "What?" He glanced around. "People are saying they're pushing you out." For a second I didn't know how to answer, because hearing someone else say it made it real. I forced a smile. No. Carlos didn't look convinced. Neither was I. The next few weeks got worse. Projects reassigned, authority reduced, meetings canceled. Access removed. It was obvious. They weren't managing me. They were isolating me. And everyone could see it. Nobody said much, but everyone saw it. Then came my birthday. October 11th. I arrived at work at 7:15 a.m., same as always, coffee in one hand, laptop in the other, completely unaware that my life was about to change. The parking lot seemed unusually quiet, almost tense. Employees avoided eye contact. People stopped talking when I walked past. My stomach tightened, instinctively, because somewhere deep inside, I already knew. I just didn't want to believe it. Then I reached my office and found Denise sitting behind my desk, Kyle beside her, Richard standing near the window, and 2 security guards at the door. The moment I saw them, everything clicked. Everything. Denise smiled, Kyle smirked, and Richard folded his arms. Then Denise slid a document across the desk. Termination paperwork. My name at the top. My heart dropped. I stared at the page, then at her, then back at the page. And Denise calmly said, "Your services are no longer required." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. I stared at the termination paperwork sitting on my desk. The desk I'd worked at for 6 years. The desk where I'd solved inventory crises, negotiated vendor contracts, covered payroll, emergencies, and spent countless nights trying to keep the company running. And now Denise was sitting behind it, like she'd already erased me. Maybe in her mind she had. I looked at the document, then at her. "You're firing me?" Denise folded her hands. "Unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately." The word almost made me laugh. Kyle leaned back in his chair, trying and failing to look important. Richard wouldn't even look me in the eye. Coward. I picked up the paperwork. No performance issues, no misconduct, no policy violations. Just restructuring. A corporate word that usually means someone wants you gone. I set it back down. Whose decision was this? Kyle answered before anyone else could. The leadership team's. Leadership team. He'd had a title for less than 4 months. I had been helping run the company for nearly a decade. The arrogance would have been impressive if it wasn't pathetic. I looked at Denise. Did Grandpa approve this before he died? Her face hardened, just for a second. Then the mask returned. Your grandfather is no longer here. There it was. The truth hiding inside the answer, because she hadn't said yes. I nodded slowly, then stood up. The security guard shifted slightly, like they expected a scene, expected anger, expected shouting. Instead, I grabbed my laptop, picked up my coffee, and walked toward the door. Halfway there, I stopped, turned around, and looked at Kyle. Really looked at him, then asked, "Do you honestly think you're ready to run this company?" His smirk vanished, only for a moment. But it vanished. That was enough. By the time I reached the parking lot, people were watching through office windows. Employees, managers, warehouse workers. Some looked angry, some looked confused. Most looked disappointed, because they understood what this meant. Maybe better than Denise did. When the people doing the work leave, the problems begin. I sat in my car, closed the door, and finally let myself breathe. The shock hit all at once, like a wave. 10 years. Gone. Just like that. Not because I'd failed. Not because I deserved it. Because I was inconvenient. Because my existence reminded certain people they hadn't earned what they had. I don't know how long I sat there. 10 minutes maybe. Maybe 20. Then my phone rang. Carlos. The warehouse supervisor, I answered. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry." I closed my eyes. Yeah. Then Carlos said something that would stay with me forever. Your grandfather would have been furious. That one hurt, because he was right. After hanging up, I started the engine, and that's when I saw it. The fireproof box, sitting in the back seat. The one I'd moved during an apartment change months earlier. The one containing an envelope I'd almost forgotten existed. The envelope Walter Whitaker gave me years ago. The envelope he told me never to open unless one particular thing happened. My heart started beating faster. Because suddenly, I knew. This was the thing. I drove home, walked inside, opened the fireproof box, and pulled out the envelope. It looked exactly the same. White. Plain. My name on the front. Emma. Nothing else. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. Then I broke the seal. Inside were 3 things: a business card, a file number, and a handwritten note. Just one sentence. One sentence from my grandfather. It read, "If they finally push you out, call immediately." I read it twice, then a third time. Underneath was a business card, Harrison and Cole Corporate Attorneys. Downtown Columbus. I had never heard of them. On the back of the card was a handwritten extension number and a client file reference. Nothing else. No explanation. No clues. Just instructions. I called. The receptionist answered immediately. I explained who I was, then read the file number. Everything changed. The woman's tone shifted instantly, like she suddenly recognized something important. "Miss Whitaker." "Yes. Please hold." 30 seconds later, another voice came on the line. An older woman. Professional. Confident. "Emma?" Yes. This is Margaret Harrison. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Then I remembered. She'd attended Grandpa's retirement party. They knew each other, apparently very well. Her next sentence made my stomach drop. Your grandfather told me this call would come eventually. Silence. I couldn't speak. Because she'd said it so casually, like she'd been expecting me. For years. Finally I managed, "What does that mean?" Margaret answered immediately. "It means I need you in my office as soon as possible." I glanced at the clock. It was 11:12 a.m. She continued, "Can you be here by noon?" "Yes." "Good." Then she paused and added, "Bring identification," before hanging up. The law office occupied the top floor of an old brick building downtown. Nothing flashy, nothing extravagant, just expensive enough to be serious. When I arrived, the receptionist already knew my name. She escorted me directly to a conference room. Inside sat Margaret Harrison. Gray hair, sharp eyes, perfect posture. The type of person who looked like she'd never lost an argument in her life. She stood, shook my hand, then said, "You look exactly like Walter." That almost broke me. She gestured toward a chair, then placed a thick folder on the table. The folder looked old, years old, like it had been waiting. For me. Margaret opened it carefully, then looked directly at me. "Emma, before we begin, I need to ask one question." I nodded. "What happened this morning?" So I told her. Everything. The firing, the meeting, the security guards, the humiliation, the years leading up to it, all of it. She listened quietly, never interrupting, never reacting, until I finished. Then she leaned back and smiled. Not a happy smile. Not exactly. More like the smile of someone watching a puzzle finally come together. Then she said, "Good." The exact same word Grandpa always used. My heart stopped, because suddenly I understood. Walter and Margaret had been planning something together, for a long time. Margaret opened the folder, removed several documents, and slid them across the table. "Emma Whitaker." She paused, then smiled. "You own 51% of Whitaker Industrial Supply." The room disappeared. Everything disappeared. The sounds, the walls, the air itself. I just stared at her, certain I'd heard wrong. "What?" She repeated it, slowly, clearly. "Your grandfather transferred controlling ownership of the company into a trust 5 years ago." My pulse thundered in my ears. "No," she nodded. "Yes." Then pushed another document toward me. Ownership records, legal filings, trust documents, signatures, dates, everything. Real, official, final. I looked down at the paperwork, then back at her, then down again. Because nothing made sense. Nothing. This has to be a mistake. It isn't. But Denise owns 19%. Kyle, 3. Richard, 7. I stared, completely speechless, then asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" Margaret smiled softly, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her. Then she answered. "Because your grandfather knew exactly who built the company." She slid one final document across the table, a handwritten letter. Walter's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, and the first line nearly made me cry. It read, "Emma, if you're reading this, they finally showed you who they are." I stopped, closed my eyes, and for the first time all day, I smiled. Because suddenly everything made sense. The lessons, the envelope, the questions, the warnings, the preparation. Walter had known. He'd known for years, and he'd been ready, the entire time. Margaret folded her hands, then said something that changed the course of my life forever. Now. She smiled. Would you like to see what else he left you? For several seconds I couldn't speak. I simply stared at Margaret Harrison, then at the documents, then back at her. Because none of it felt real. A few hours earlier, I had been unemployed, humiliated, escorted out of the company by security. Now I was being told I controlled it. Not partially, not symbolically, completely. Margaret opened another folder. This one was even thicker. Inside were years of records, meeting notes, audits, financial statements, emails, board reports. Some were highlighted, others had sticky notes attached, all organized with terrifying precision. The kind of precision only lawyers and very determined old men possess. What is all this? Margaret smiled. Insurance. I frowned. Against what? Her answer came immediately. Your family. Then she began turning pages, one after another. Unauthorized expense reports, questionable reimbursements, personal vacations charged to company accounts, vehicles purchased through corporate funds, consulting contracts awarded to friends, luxury dinners, private memberships, financial transfers, everything documented, everything legal evidence, everything collected over years. My stomach dropped, because the deeper we went, the worse it got. Finally, Margaret stopped. She pointed at a document, a note written entirely in Walter Whitaker's handwriting. Dated 4 years earlier, I recognized his writing instantly. The note read, "If Denise ever removes Emma from the company, execute all protections immediately." Below that, "If Kyle attempts operational control, require full board review." Below that, "If Richard remains involved after my death, audit every contract he touches." I looked up, speechless. Margaret nodded. Your grandfather trusted very few things. Then she tapped the note. But he trusted patterns. Suddenly dozens of old memories clicked together. Conversations, warnings, questions, lessons, everything. Walter wasn't guessing. He knew exactly who they were. Margaret closed the folder, then slid a final document across the table. A notice for an emergency shareholder meeting. Already prepared, already scheduled, already filed. My eyes widened. When was this created? She checked the date. 3 years ago. 3 years. 3 entire years. Walter had anticipated everything. I started laughing. Not because anything was funny, because I couldn't process it. 3 years ago, 3 years before today's firing, Walter had already prepared the response. Margaret waited until I calmed down, then asked, "Would you like to know your grandfather's final instruction?" I nodded. She opened another envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 1 sentence, typed, signed. Not emotional, not dramatic. Pure Walter. It read, "Do not save them from the consequences of their own choices." I stared at the page, then laughed again, because that sounded exactly like him. Margaret stood, walked toward the window, then turned back. "Emma." "Yeah?" "The board meeting is tomorrow." My heart skipped. Tomorrow. Not weeks, not months. Tomorrow. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa. The warehouse, the envelope, the firing, the trust, everything. By sunrise, I was exhausted, but ready. More ready than I'd ever been. The board meeting began at 10 a.m., Whitaker Industrial Supply Headquarters, Executive Conference Room. The same room where I'd been excluded for months. The same room where Denise had slowly pushed me aside. The same room where she believed she was in control. When I arrived, I stayed outside for a moment, watching through the glass. Denise was smiling. Kyle was scrolling through his phone. Richard was drinking coffee. Relaxed, comfortable, confident. Why wouldn't they be? As far as they knew, I was gone. Margaret arrived beside me, holding a leather briefcase. She looked through the glass, then smiled. "Ready?" I took a deep breath, then nodded. "Ready." We opened the door and walked in. The room went silent, instantly. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Every eye landed on me. Kyle looked confused, then annoyed, then confused again. Denise's smile disappeared. Richard nearly dropped his coffee. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Denise broke the silence. "What are you doing here?" Margaret answered before I could. "Representing the majority shareholder." The room froze. Denise blinked. "Excuse me?" Margaret calmly placed her briefcase on the table, opened it, removed a stack of legal documents, then repeated herself. "Representing the majority shareholder." The board members exchanged nervous glances. Nobody understood. Yet, Kyle laughed. Actually laughed. A short, arrogant laugh. Then leaned back. "Who exactly is the majority shareholder?" Margaret looked directly at him and smiled. "Emma Whitaker." Silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that only exists after a bomb explodes. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the room forgot how. Then Kyle laughed again. Only this time it sounded forced. "That's impossible." Margaret slid the trust documents across the table. "Actually, it's extremely possible." One board member picked up the paperwork, then another, then another. Pages turned. Expressions changed. Shock, confusion, disbelief, then realization. Richard's face went white, completely white, like someone had unplugged him. He started flipping through pages, faster and faster, searching for an error, a loophole, anything. There wasn't one. Denise looked at me, not angry, not yet. First came something else. Fear, real fear, because for the first time she understood. The game was over. The chairman cleared his throat, then looked at the ownership records, then at me, then back at the records. Finally he spoke. "These documents appear valid." Margaret nodded. "They are." Another long silence followed. Then the chairman asked the question everyone was thinking. "Missy Whitaker, what would you like to do?" I looked around the room. At the people who fired me. At the people who underestimated me. At the people who spent years assuming I would always accept whatever treatment they gave me. Then I remembered Grandpa's final instruction. Do not save them from the consequences of their own choices. I stood, looked directly at Denise, then at Kyle, then Richard, and finally said, "I'd like to begin with an audit." The room exploded. The room exploded. Questions, arguments, interruptions, everyone talking over everyone else. Kyle was the loudest. Of course he was. "This is ridiculous." He slapped the table. "She's doing this out of spite." Margaret didn't even look at him. She simply opened another folder, then said 4 words. "Let's review the evidence." The room became quiet again. Immediately. Because people who yell usually stop yelling when proof enters the conversation. For the next 2 hours, the board reviewed documents. Page after page, year after year. Transaction after transaction, and with every page, the mood changed. At first the board members looked skeptical, then concerned, then shocked, finally angry. Not at me, at Denise, at Richard, at Kyle. The evidence was overwhelming. Corporate funds used for personal vacations. Company credit cards paying for luxury purchases. Consulting contracts awarded without competitive bids. Vendor relationships manipulated. Unauthorized reimbursements. Improper spending. Everything documented. Everything traceable. Everything real. Richard tried defending himself for about 10 minutes, then stopped. Because every explanation created 3 new problems. Every excuse led to another document, another email, another approval form, another signature. Eventually, he just sat there, sweating, silent, defeated. Kyle's situation was even worse, because unlike Richard, he wasn't corrupt, he was incompetent, and incompetence leaves fingerprints everywhere. Failed projects, missed deadlines, bad decisions, ignored warnings, operational mistakes. The deeper the board looked, the more obvious it became. Kyle wasn't running anything. Employees had been covering for him for years. Mostly me. That realization hit harder than I expected, because sitting there, watching everything unfold, I realized how much energy I'd spent protecting people who would have never protected me. Years of fixing mistakes, solving problems, taking responsibility. And for what? So they could fire me? By mid-afternoon, the board called a recess. Everyone left the room except me and Margaret. I stared out the window overlooking the warehouse. The same warehouse where Grandpa taught me inventory, where he taught me leadership, where he taught me business. The same warehouse where everything started. Margaret joined me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "How are you holding up?" I thought about it. Honestly, I didn't know. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt exhausted. Part of me simply missed Walter. Finally, I said, "I wish he could see this." Margaret smiled, then shook her head. "Emma." "What?" "He already did." I looked at her, confused. She pointed toward the boardroom, toward the documents, toward the consequences, toward the truth. He saw it years ago. That hit me harder than I expected, because she was right. Walter had already seen everything. He just happened to be the only person paying attention. The board reconvened at 4 o'clock. This time there were no arguments, no debates, no confusion, only decisions. The chairman cleared his throat, then read the findings. Unauthorized spending, breach of fiduciary responsibilities, governance violations, mismanagement, conflict of interest concerns. The list felt endless. Finally, he looked at Denise, then Richard, then Kyle, and announced the board's recommendation: immediate removal from all leadership positions, effective immediately. The room went silent. Again. Denise looked stunned, like someone had pulled the floor from beneath her. For years, she'd controlled every room she entered, every conversation, every narrative, and now none of it mattered. Facts had arrived. Facts don't care about stories. Kyle stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane," nobody responded. Not a single person, because for the first time in his life, nobody was interested in protecting him. Richard simply stared at the table. 20 years of influence, gone, in one afternoon. Then the chairman turned toward me. "Miss Whitaker." I looked up. "Yes?" "As majority shareholder, do you accept the board's recommendation?" I thought about Grandpa, his lessons, his values, his final instruction. Do not save them from the consequences of their own choices. Then I answered, "Yes." Just like that, it was over. No dramatic speech, no screaming, no revenge monologue, just one word. "Yes." The following week brought more changes. An independent audit expanded. Additional reviews began. Outside consultants arrived. Processes were examined. Contracts were reviewed. Policies were rewritten. For the first time in years, the company started cleaning house. Meanwhile, employees slowly learned the truth. Not rumors, not gossip, the actual truth. About ownership, about Walter's trust, about the board meeting, about the audit, about everything. And something unexpected happened. People started stopping me in hallways, in warehouses, in parking lots, not to congratulate me, to thank me. One employee named Sarah approached me during lunch. She'd worked there 17 years. Quiet woman, never complained, never caused problems. She handed me a card. Inside were signatures, dozens of them. Employees from every department. A simple message. Your grandfather would be proud. I almost cried reading it. Because after everything, that was the only opinion that mattered. Walter's. And somehow, I felt like I finally understood what he'd been building. It wasn't just a company. It was a community. And he'd trusted me to protect it. 3 months later, I officially became CEO. Not because I demanded it, not because I inherited it, because the board voted unanimously. They trusted me, the same way Walter had. My first major decision surprised everyone, especially the board. Instead of renovating executive offices, I expanded employee benefits. Health coverage, training programs, scholarships, emergency assistance funds, the things Walter always cared about, the things people actually needed. Some investors questioned it. At first, then profits increased, employee turnover dropped, productivity improved. Customer retention grew. Funny how treating people well often turns out to be good business. Grandpa would have loved that. 6 months later, we completed another project, one that mattered more than any financial report, more than any quarterly result, more than any stock valuation. We renamed the Employee Training Center, the Walter Whitaker Leadership Center. A permanent tribute. Inside the entrance hung a bronze plaque. Simple. Nothing flashy. Exactly the way he would have wanted. The plaque contained only one sentence. A sentence I'd heard dozens of times growing up, a sentence that explained everything. It read, "The people doing the work are the company. Walter Whitaker." The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of employees, current workers, retirees, families, friends. People whose lives he'd changed. People who never forgot. Near the end of the ceremony, an older man approached me. Former warehouse employee, retired years earlier. He looked at the plaque, then at me, then smiled. "You know." "What?" "You walk exactly like him." I laughed. "So I've heard." The man nodded, then pointed toward the warehouse. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "Everyone thought he was building a company." I smiled, because I already knew the answer. He was building people. The old man grinned. "Exactly." That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in Grandpa's old office, the office he'd refused to renovate, the office where he'd planned everything, the office where he'd quietly protected me for years without ever telling me. The room looked almost identical. His bookshelf, his desk, his photographs. Even his old coffee mug remained on a shelf, exactly where he'd left it. I opened the final letter Margaret had given me, the one I'd been saving, the one written shortly before he died. I unfolded it carefully, then began reading. Emma. If everything happened the way I suspect it did, you're probably sitting in my office right now. First, I'd like to point out that I told you so. I laughed immediately. Because of course he started that way. Of course. The letter continued. You spent years believing you needed to earn your place. You never did. You already belonged. The right people knew it. I stopped reading for a moment, because those words hit harder than anything else. Not the ownership, not the company, not the money. That you already belonged. The thing I'd spent years trying to prove had never needed proving. I continued. Don't waste your life being angry. Don't become them. Build something better. That's the only revenge that lasts. I sat quietly after finishing, looking around the office, thinking about everything: the firing, the betrayal, the trust, the board meeting, the consequences, the victory. And finally, I understood something. My grandfather never cared about revenge. Not really. What he cared about was protection. He didn't spend 5 years building a trap. He spent 5 years building a shield. For me. The next morning, I arrived at work before sunrise, just like Walter used to. The warehouse lights glowed in the darkness. Employees slowly arrived. Forklifts started moving. Deliveries started rolling in. Business continued. Life continued. I stood on the warehouse floor, coffee in hand, watching people work, watching the company breathe, watching Walter's legacy continue. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt at home. Not because I owned the company, not because I was CEO, not because I won, but because I finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to teach me all along. The people who matter don't make you earn your place. They remind you that you already have one. My name is Emma Whitaker. At 28 years old, my stepfamily fired me from the company my grandfather built. 6 hours later, I discovered I owned 51% of it. A year later, I was running it. But the best thing Walter Whitaker ever left me wasn't a business. It wasn't money. It wasn't power. It was certainty. The certainty that one person saw me clearly, long before anyone else did. And sometimes, that's worth more than everything else combined.